Coming up next, our Breaking Ground track continues with Raghudeep Kannavara and Alan Sheng's presentation of Ghost DMA Attack and the SeDeFuS Conundrum.
Hey everyone, this is Raghudeep Kannavara and Alan Sheng. We work for Intel Corp. Today we'll be talking about the Ghost DMA Attack and the SeDeFuS Conundrum. And it's a pleasure to be addressing you all today, and hopefully you will find this talk interesting. So let's go over the agenda of what we want to cover briefly. We'll talk about the DMA attack and DMA attack mitigations. This is all well published and available in public literature. We'll then switch gears and talk a little bit about the SeDeFuS Conundrum and what we mean by SeDeFuS Conundrum and why it's important in this discussion. We'll follow that up by the Ghost DMA attack discussion and the mitigations for the Ghost DMA attack, which is obviously the meat of this talk today. And we will follow that up by a demo, which is the highlight, I believe, for the talk. So without further delay, let's get the disclaimer out of the way. This talk is presented exclusively for your security infotainment. Any resemblance to actual products deployed in field or end of life is purely informational. And we really hope that you find this talk useful. And any Q&A, we can wait till the end of the session. So let's talk about DMA attacks. DMA attack is the exploitation of a computer's ports to access sensitive data. This is well documented, and there has been mitigations that have already been published in the space. When an external device plugs into a computer, it connects using direct hardware access to read or write directly to main memory without any operating system supervision or interaction. And this means that the OS security policies are bypassed, allowing the connected device to access and directly read or write sensitive data, which presents an opportunity for a DMA attack. And if your computer has such a port like the Thunderbolt port, an attacker who gets brief physical access is the key to this discussion, to access all your data, even if your drive is encrypted or your computer is locked or set to sleep. So DMA attacks via PCIe devices so far have required physical access to a computer to launch a successful attack. And like we talked about before, Thunderclap and Thunderspy are well-documented attacks that have been discussed at different conferences. And the mitigation for DMA attacks are also available. DMA remapping for device drivers protects against memory corruption and malicious DMA attacks, and it provides a higher level of compatibility for devices. On kernel DMA protection enabled systems, DMA guard policy may block devices with DMA remapping incompatible drivers connected to external or exposed PCIe ports such as a Thunderbolt, depending on the policy value set by the system administrator. And of course, at the hardware level, Intel IOMU, also called the VTD, enabled DMA remapping, supports address translation for DMA from devices. So a quick look at how the IOMMU interacts with the physical memory and the DMA capable device. Essentially, IOMMU is translating all the accesses to the main memory and converting the virtual IO address from a DMA capable device to a physical address that's mapped to the main memory, which is very similar in concept where it originated from to the CPU side of the world, where you have the memory management unit, which actually converts the physical virtual address to the physical address and vice versa as well. So any address translation has to go through the MMU. So you have this layer of protection when VTD is enabled and when IOMMU is working, and arbitrary address accesses in the main memory should be prevented. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about security and debuggability. For security, a system tries to minimize or eliminate information exposed. That is essentially security and privacy sensitive data that we try to minimize the exposure of. Debug capabilities, on the other hand, seek to provide observability so that the user can actually debug the system and access system internals. Security and debuggability are thus are on the opposite end of the spectrum. And there are corner cases that we find when one is required to turn off security countermeasures in order to enable debuggability, and this could be an attack vector, right? For example, turning off VTD to enable debug, which is not a general practice, which is not recommended, but there could be a corner case, and the user, if he or she is doing that, should be aware of the risks in doing so. So interesting attack surfaces emerge at the intersection of security and debuggability. This is just a screenshot showing that VTD can be enabled or disabled. This is a BIOS setup utility option that user can control. So the other interesting concept that we want to talk about is security and functionality and usability. Good security with adequate functionality and usability is really important. And specifically when we talk about third-party apps and third-party firmware that are often enabled to run on platform integrated hardware subsystems or accelerators that seek to provide better functionality and usability of the hardware to both the OEM ISV and the consumer with rich user experiences like audio or video processing experience. Some of these, some examples of these platform integrated subsystems are sensor hubs, audio video processing units, or similar PCIe endpoints. These subsystems usually have some RTOS running on a microcontroller with a dedicated local SRAM and potentially a DMA engine. And that is a really interesting area for from a security perspective. So in order to function, subsystems require access to main memory, for example, reading in audio data or sensor data to process data and write back data back to the main memory and interact with the applications running in the context of the operating system from within the subsystem and talking to the operating system or the file system, for example. For subsystem memory accesses to pass through IOMMU, VTD needs to be enabled, and the device driver needs to support DMA remapping. Else, the subsystem has direct access to host physical memory. That means it can bypass the operating system security mechanisms, right? And specifically, if there are third-party apps and third-party firmware running on a subsystem that are malicious, direct access to the host physical address can be catastrophic. So in this cartoon, we want to talk about the different moving parts and explain a little bit about what is trusted and what is not trusted in a hardware subsystem. So this on the picture on the left shows you the software, firmware, and hardware stack. You have the third-party app running on the operating system within the context of the operating system, and that we believe is outside the trust boundary, while the device driver and the OS kernel is within our trust domain. The third-party firmware, which is also in this case running on the microcontroller, is could be malicious, while the OEM firmware is trusted, which is color-coded in green. All of these firmware have access to the DMA engine that is on the hardware subsystem. And if VTD is enabled, all the address transactions from this DMA engine actually map to a address translated by the IOMMU into the main memory. But if the VTD is disabled, IOMMU doesn't come into the picture, so you have direct accesses to the physical address, and it could be a rogue access, and that is very dangerous in this case. Hence, we want to call out the conundrum is what we figure. If you look at it here, security, debuggability, functionality, and usability are on different spectrum. Just want to show that this there are certain trade-offs that need to happen. There are certain considerations that need to go into architecture design and implementation when we are trying to bring together different concepts. And there's one additional spectrum here that we haven't talked about in this diagram, and we'll talk about it in the next few slides. So if you have thought about it, hold on to the thought, and we can discuss that later. So now switching gears back to the DMA attack, We want to talk about the ghost DMA attack in this discussion, obviously. We believe this is a new class of DMA attacks that do not require physical access to a computer. The attack is launched by malicious third-party apps and firmware that run on platform integrated hardware subsystems, which are essentially PCIe endpoints. By manipulating programming the subsystem's DMA engine to perform arbitrary accesses to the host physical address space by passing the operating system security policies. The goal here is to read, modify, or corrupt arbitrary address locations in the host physical address space, which is the goal for any DMA attack. And the consequence of such an attack could be ranging from a DOS to PDOS, depending on the privilege that the firmware has, to memory corruption, arbitrary code injection, and also information leakage on how the attack, if our information leakage is possible depending on how the attack is structured. But essentially, any DMA attack that requires physical access this is something that could attain the same kind of impact. How would it work? For the ghost DMA attack to work, the attacker does not need physical access to the computer. The attacker only needs to ensure malicious third-party app and firmware is installed on the user's computer. Malicious third-party app and firmware can be installed by leveraging vulnerable or insecure, software firmware update mechanisms. Think SolarWinds, which was recently in the news, or simply by social engineering. It's possible to get like malicious updates on the device. The malicious app runs in the user space context, that is within the context of the operating system. It can continually poll the presence of DMAR entry in the ACPI tables and infer VTD is disabled if DMAR entry is absent in the ACPI tables, and then it can launch a DMA attack through the subsystem's DMA engine. If the VTD is disabled, either by default for debugging purposes or for any other reason, even though the computer is in the safe custody of the rightful owner, the DMA attack succeeds once malicious, especially the firmware is installed and it starts executing. So why does this attack work? So let's talk about the threat model here. The threat model assumes the following. The malicious third-party app and the firmware is installed on the user's computer and hardware subsystem. That is a prerequisite. And in order for that to happen, like we discussed, there should be some kind of social engineering, or there is a broken software firmware update mechanism that needs to be exploited. The malicious firmware has access to all of DMA engine in the hardware subsystem, and it can reprogram it to access arbitrary host address space, which is a prerequisite here. And we have cases where we have seen this is possible. The DMA engine does not separate subsystem versus host accessible ranges. So there is no privilege separation between between the subsystem's memory that the firmware can access versus the host accessible ranges within the host. Malicious third-party app can monitor the DMAR entry in ACPI tables and communicate with the third-party firmware API. So the app can instruct the firmware through the firmware APIs to perform certain malicious actions. And this is required for enabling usability. We talked about how data could be streamed to like the main memory for audio processing or certain kind of operation. So this is entirely possible. So having described what the threat model is, in this case, we want to state that the device drivers and the operating system kernels are trusted. There is no exploitable vulnerability required in this case. Vulnerable device drivers allow an attacker to gain access to the kernel and compromise the entire operating system. You don't really need this kind of attack if you have a vulnerable device driver. So let's talk a little bit about the ACPI and DMAR. The ACPI stands for Advanced Configuration and Power Interface Tables. These can be read from user space. There are tools you could Google online and you'll be able to find certain freely available tools to read and dump ACPI tables. DMAR stands for Direct Memory Access Remapping. If VTD is enabled, DMAR table is configured, and ACPI dump, when you dump the ACPI tables, you will find that there is a DMAR entry, and and an application can monitor for that entry to see if VTD is enabled from the user space. And yes, we really don't need to monitor the DMAR table to verify if VTD is disabled, right? We can always launch a brute force attack. Malware can always do that. If VTD is disabled, the attack will, work. If worst case scenario, the attack fails if VTD is enabled. So, it could just do a brute force attack. Even if VTD is enabled, and if the device driver doesn't take advantage of VTD, the attack will still work, right? Because the device driver and because the DMA guard policy may not be updated or may not be active, and the device driver is not taking advantage of VTD, right? And of course, the security trade-offs with performance gain is another important topic that we actually missed when we talk about the conundrum. So we've seen many security issues come up when we optimize for performance. And one example here is the PCIe address translation service to bypass IOMMU. This was described by the set of researchers who talked about the thunderclap vulnerability. Because DMA remapping has performance costs, address translation service enables PCIe endpoints to cache, to participate in translation cache management. Essentially, you're caching the addresses. So these devices can maintain their own cache of translations in the address translation cache. And using this feature, any device can claim it's using an address that's already been translated and thus bypass IOMMU translation, right? That's like bypass of the IOMMU capability here. For trusted devices, this is a useful performance improvement. But let's say you have an untrusted device, or the firmware running on the device is untrusted, then ATS could allow a compromised device to ignore IOMMU and write to places that it shouldn't have access to in the first place. So let's switch gears and talk about what is the ghost DMA attack sequence and how does it actually manifest. So let's start with the user. User here either naively installs the malicious third-party app or firmware or the subsystem update mechanism has an exploitable vulnerability that an attacker can take advantage of. So this could be either one of these cases, but essentially the prerequisite is that we need to have the malicious third-party firmware installed on the PCIe integrated PCIe device. Malware monitors the presence of DMAR entry in the ACPI tables on the user's computer from user space. If DMAR entry is missing in, VTD is disabled, but essentially this is not needed. You could always launch a brute force attack, but this just makes the attack more sophisticated or complex maybe. And the malware launches ghost DMA attack, right? That means that the firmware is compromised in this case, and it can reprogram the DMA to access arbitrary address locations in the host. You could, create memory corruption issues, inject arbitrary code in the kernel space, or essentially dump the entire kernel onto the file system and then do some processing. Or you could actually have the malware connect back to an attacker control server in the guise of user approved telemetry, or maybe without user approval, and exfiltrate user data to attacker control server at any time of the malware's choosing, right? So you send anonymous data to so this is a play on the alphabets here, but you trick the user into sending data out of the system. So the impact of the ghost DMA attack is, if the attack succeeds, it's actually stealthier and more dangerous than traditional DMA attacks because it firstly doesn't require physical access. It can affect many computers that are vulnerable at the same time because the update mechanism could potentially be exploited on many systems at the same time. And it is persistent because it actually resides not in the file system. It resides, the malware could reside, essentially the firmware could reside on a PCIe integrated endpoint. So the attacker can run arbitrary code at the highest privilege level, and potentially gain access to kernel memory, passwords, banking, logins, encryption keys, file systems, you name what, you have the entire kernel space that the malware can access and dump and do some analysis on it. So obviously mitigating ghost DMA attack is important, right? From a OEM or ISV perspective, enabling DMA remapping for device drivers is very important. Have secure install and update mechanisms to authenticate or verify the integrity of the software, firmware, apps. Ensure privilege separation for DMA operations for third-party firmware or apps on subsystems. That's really important. From a user perspective, beware of social engineering tactics. Never install software that you cannot trust. Also enable kernel DMA protection, Windows 10 onwards, right? And DMA guard policy. And always have VTD turned on. And if you're not a normal user, if you're a normal user, you probably are not doing this. But if you are trying to debug a system, then it might require turning off VTD, for example. Then you're back to square four. So I mean, back here. So you should never install software that you don't trust. So the key takeaways that we want to highlight in this talk before we jump into the demo section is that platform integrated subsystems include like sensor hubs and audio video processing units or similar PCIe endpoints that are integrated on the device. These seek to enable rich user experience, but they have certain attack surfaces that should be reviewed for security. These subsystems usually have an RTOS running on a microcontroller with a dedicated local SRAM and a DMA engine, which is an interesting attack vector. These devices, so like I said, present a rich opportunity for an attacker to launch DMA attacks without physical access by exploiting weaknesses in the update mechanism, especially if you're supporting like third-party updates. This could be an attack vector. Enabling third-party apps and firmware to run on such subsystems certainly requires security considerations. So OEMs and ISVs need to be cognizant of subsystem security, the privilege provided to third-party apps and firmware running on these subsystems, and their update mechanisms. So let's talk about the demo. This is the highlight of our discussion today. So I have my colleague Alan on the bridge. Alan, do you want to talk about the demo, and also we can play the video of the demo actually working. So please take over.
Sure. Thanks, Raghu. So we have this demo section, and in this section, I will first brief what we did, and then we have the pre-record video so that Raghu can play. So in this demo, we just try to demonstrate how we use a pretty old Intel platform to create a tool and then hijack the firmware on top of one of integrated IP subsystem so that we use a tool to master the firmware to dump the memory from the Windows managed host memory. And then we use a kernel, Windows kernel debugger to verify and make sure that that's the same Windows kernel space data. So to hijack the IP system firmware is not easy, and this is not our focus today. We just demonstrate how possible when people disable VTD and the possibility to have this illegal memory dump, as well as you can override the memory. Okay, Raghu, can you go the video?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's watch the demo. This is a Intel cabinet board that we used for the demonstration. Intel Kaby Lake SoC has a few integrated microcontroller IP. Most of those microcontroller IP has built-in DMA controller. We created one Windows-based tool which can send commands to one of those microcontrollers, and then modify the microcontroller firmware which could receive the command from this tool. This tool can send command to firmware to ask firmware to start its DMA to dump data from Windows managed host memory. The DMA can read and write the host memory, but from this demo, we just show the read operation. So I open one Windows command line window. So you can see this tool. This is for the demonstration. So actually, which memory address I want to access? Kernel-based address. It's a 3000000. So I just copy and paste into the command line window, and then the tool will send this command to the microcontroller firmware, and then microcontroller firmware just do DMA to dump the address data, and then feed back to this tool, and this tool will store all those dumped data into this output file. So if you look at the dumped data, yeah, from here, this the 3000000, the dumped data. So do remember 4D5890, because later we will use WinDebug to verify those data. So the virtual address of empty kernel. So this actually shows the virtual address. Then we need to convert the virtual address to the physical address. So we use the PTE command to convert the virtual address to the physical address. Then use the db command to dump the from this physical address 3000000, and give a length. So if you look at the dumped data, 4D5890. So this match to the data we dumped from the tool.
Okay, I think that's all from the demo. Back to you, Raghu.
Thank you, Alan. And that brings us to the Q&A session here. So thank you for listening to our talk, and we are open to any questions that we could potentially provide some more clarification on. So please go ahead.
Thank you for joining us, and I would love to hear, like, what brought you to look at this particular, kind of aspect of the system, and why'd you go poking in here, and what makes this something that was worth all the effort?
Thank you, Damon. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks for hosting our talk today at BSides. So to your question, I think it's a really interesting question. My role in my organization is helping with the security development lifecycle for the products we ship from our business unit. That means I have this opportunity to work with very intelligent and excellent people who drive product engineering. And one of the issues that we found when we were poking around with this specific IP subsystem is on the older platforms, we realized that there was an ability to muck around with the firmware running on the microcontroller in this subsystem. And this interestingly had a DMA engine that could directly talk to the host DMA space. And if you could get the firmware to somehow misbehave and communicate with the actual app that's controlling this firmware in the third-party ecosystem, we were, thinking that there is a potential attack vector here where we could, corrupt the host memory or, siphon off information from the host memory, working in tandem with the application that's running in the host operating system space in some form. So we started poking around a little bit, and we kind of came across, came up with this proof of concept that Alan actually demonstrated to us. So it's part of our security evaluation work, and I just wanted to mention that this issue is right now on fixed. It's on an older platform that's end of life, so we got it out of the way. We made sure it's fixed. It's not on newer platforms, but we just want to highlight that this is an important area for the industry to be looking at, because we talk about DMA attacks from Thunderbolt and PCIe ports, but when we talk about PCIe integrated subsystems, they offer a very interesting attack vector. And when we open up that subsystem for third-party development, hosting third-party apps and third-party firmware, it becomes even more interesting. And that's why we thought this is an interesting message to convey.
Right. Yeah. No. It's the general class of thing that's the most fascinating part of this, not so much the specific platform that you found it on. So what would you hope that people would take away from this, the most out of this conversation that you're trying to have here?
We believe that this is an important attack surface that probably has not been explored that much, or not a lot of research or publications. We haven't found many in the space, and maybe because it's a very corner case, but we see that this is a space that is going to expand when we allow these different third-party vendors and OEMs to work closely and collaboratively to develop applications and rich user experience applications on platforms. We feel that in the future, this is an area that is worth exploring and paying attention to. So we thought this could be a talk that would highlight this, and the demo would actually make this a little bit more interesting.
Yeah. So, and one of the things, I mean, I love a good breaking. I love, we all get excited about, ooh, hey, look, we can get into the thing and make it do stuff it wasn't supposed to do. One of the key things I've always tried to bring to BSides is that finding and breaking things is great, but it doesn't mean anything if we can't make things better and use it to help move the industry forward. So what would you say, just even at a tactical level, what would the average help desk admin or enterprise blue team folks do to best secure their make sure their company's securing their devices at the build and configuration stage, so that this kind of thing as a general class isn't going to be a problem for them?
That's a really good question. I think the core of the problem that we are trying to build upon is the ability to get malicious firmware installed on a PCIe subsystem. I think if we can patch that specific hole, this whole class of attack would obviously not work. So we are trying to convey the message that make sure your firmware updates are reliable. You don't get malicious firmware to install on your machine, just from industry perspective. And then when you work with your third-party partners, have a mechanism to make sure that their firmware that's getting installed on the subsystem or the hardware is also verifiable in the chain of trust in some way. Right, so build that entire chain of trust from your base firmware to the third-party firmware that you're letting install on your machine. I think that involves some kind of close collaboration with industry partners, like for our company and the OEMs or ISVs working in the space, right? And the general class of, sorry, go ahead.
No. Please continue.
So I mean, from right, from a debug perspective, I think the virtualization, that's an idea we were poking around, but generally we don't expect a user to turn off virtualization normal user wouldn't probably be doing that, but given the current case, you are trying to turn off virtualization to do some debugging, maybe this is an attack surface that would get exposed. We just wanted to highlight that when you're interested in debugging, there might be side effects that you need to be careful of.
And that's ultimately is something that is, to some degree, I mean, if you are going to play in this pool, you're reliant on the manufacturing partners and so forth that you're getting these devices from to come up with some part of that solution for your trust stack that you're building there, or is this do you see this as something that you can entirely knowing that you're taking this risk, that you can entirely improve or defend yourself against in your own right?
So there has to be some kind of trust. So you would have to establish a mechanism with your partner to make sure that their applications are verified. That has to be a prerequisite, and we do have that in place. The other thing that I want to highlight is when you are architecting your system, you want to have some kind of privilege separation on what your base firmware or OEM firmware can access versus a third-party firmware can access, what privileges you provide, and having that, as part of your security architecture, providing that definition of privilege separation and access controls could be another way, architecting from ground up, and then building the mechanism of verifying the third-party firmware and signatures. And how do you do that? How do you enable secure firmware update? You could build on top of it. So yeah, I guess it's a defense in depth problem. So you would build it from the bottom up, build good, robust process on top of it to make sure firmware updates are secure.
All right. I guess if that's a lot of scaffolding to have to put in place, at a lot of layers for one company. But I think that's, if that's the state of where we are, if there's not a way to, some sort of like shared framework for doing that, like in a consistent way that would guide people in the right direction. Where's the opportunity to look at this, beyond the boundaries of just like one vendor, one company, and to kind of come up with guidance where, people can do this in a good way, rather than having to invent it from, scratch themselves.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So there are mechanisms that we use today to enable secure firmware updates and also verify the authenticity of the third-party firmware. So as I said, this is an issue that we we believe we have addressed at the core when we are working with third-party vendors and OEMs. But there might always be a corner case when things go wrong. So as long as you architect for defense in depth, but the implementation has a buffer overflow, so you can never really be sure if something goes wrong or someone uses like a weak RSA or wrong, key size. There might, that's the implementation is where you probably find.
Like all crypto problems, right? And verification of the legitimacy of something. It's all comes down to implementation. That's why the pattern I've seen over and over again is people, they implement a trusted compute module they think they're using a good certificate based PKI or something, and they get one little thing wrong, right? And it it's everything they're doing. So, which is why I'm like kind of pushing towards that. What would you think? How do we get to a place where that's more, less prone to the implementation errors at every layer, right?
Yeah. I think validate what you. Yeah.
I'm not expecting you to have a solution.
Yeah. That's true.
Kind of like spitballing. As somebody who works in the space, what's your idea?
Yeah. Yeah, I think validation, having robust security validation, black box or hacker mindset to, looking at your system from an external perspective, trying to break the system, reverse engineering it, having those kind of teams working on your systems, especially systems like these that are very interesting for an attacker. Having company-wide efforts to do penetration testing or hackathons or working with external researchers, getting their points of view, just be cognizant of the changing threat landscape, what kind of attack surfaces are emerging, new tools, right? So I think it's a game that we need to catch up on, right?
Sure. So at the very least, in a larger company, you can centralize these kinds of processes and have teams that are familiar with working, practice and maybe frameworks and tooling to like prevent every, development team within your company having to reinvent that wheel. But across companies, it's the Wild West still, right? And we're just probably not going to get there. Yeah.
Right.
All right.
Well, that's a really interesting challenge.
I appreciate you entertaining me while I poke at like the fringes of the impossible. But and also very much just being here today to share this with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
If anybody has any further questions, you can put them in the Discord. I assume you've got access. You know how to find the Breaking Ground channel on our Discord. If not, people can hit you up on Twitter, or what's the best way to get in contact with you if someone wants to continue this conversation?
So the best way to just contact me is on LinkedIn. My name on LinkedIn, I should be able to find me. I'm probably the only person with that name on the planet, so it's easy to find me.
Good. How did I do with the name, by the way? I wasn't. Did I butcher it really badly?
No, you're good. You're correct.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah. Awesome. That's my biggest terror. Like generally when we do these, it's in person and there's a human being, and I just walk up before the talk and say, "Hey, how do I pronounce your name? Is it this way? Is it how would you like me to refer to you?" And we haven't been able to do that here this year. So I'm always fingers crossed in those recordings. But anyway, have a great day.
You too, Damon. Thank you. Thanks for hosting me and our talk. Take care.